For Maidens Meadow, an original story written and read by Miss Worm. Smith lay back in his chair with a contented sigh.
That was an exceedingly fine spread, old chap. I shall pay my compliments to your cook as soon as I've finished this cigar.
I put another log on the fire and surreptitiously undid the top button on my trousers. It had been a fine spread indeed.
You're too late, I'm afraid. She'll have returned to the village by now. Oh? I thought she lived in.
He blew a smoke ring into the gathering darkness of my study, and we followed its progress through the thick fug of tobacco and brandy fumes.
Not on Christmas Eve. All the staff are gone well before dusk. It's a funny little superstition of theirs. Ah, do I detect a ghost story in the offing?
I shifted in my seat uneasily. Smith is the most appalling scoffer. Or he was, back then. His opinions have changed since... but I am getting ahead of myself. As I was saying, he was a cynic of the worst kind, and my reluctance to tell the story only served to whet his appetite further, and he pressed me with good-natured ribbing until I finally exclaimed, "No, not a ghost story, merely a little local colour about For Maidens Meadow. Nothing of any interest." And I hoped he would leave it at that. Of course, he didn't, and a spark of inquisitiveness fired up in his eyes.
For Maidens Meadow, isn't that the field at the end of your garden?
I nodded and tried to change the subject to butterflies, for Smith is a keen amateur lepidopterist. I spotted a large tortoiseshell there last summer. They're becoming quite rare, I believe. He saw through that ploy in an instant and pounced upon my reticence.
Well, you needn't think you're getting away with that. Tell me the story. I shan't interrupt. You have my word.
Well, I gave him a look at that, for he's a dreadful interrupter. But he was unlikely to let the matter rest, so I topped up our brandies and began. When I first came to Corkscrew Cottage, I made inquiries about the surrounding land. There is a fine view of the sea from the terrace, and I didn't fancy the idea of some town dweller coming down and deciding to build some monstrosity in the middle of my eye line. The local land agent assured me that such a thing could never happen, for there is some sort of a covenant on the meadow that denies permission to build. The agent was unwilling to give me the details at first, but I told him I'd pull out of the sale if he didn't, so he eventually gave me some of its history. You'll have seen, if you looked from your bedroom window, that there is a series of standing stones in the field.
I did spot them, now that you mention it,
he said, having already forgotten his promise to not interrupt.
I counted 7, not quite in a circle.
I nodded. 3 pairs and a single monolith that stands by itself. I rose and crossed to the window. The sun had set some time ago, and the winter twilight was rapidly descending into darkness. I could just make out the solitary stone from where I stood, and I beckoned Smith to join me. There she is. Do you see her?
You say she?
One of the 4 maidens. And I pointed out 3 other stones. They were the shorter of the 7, each being paired with a taller partner.
I suppose at this angle, he said, it does have something of a woman's figure to it.
He twitched the curtains closed and helped himself to another brandy.
But what's the story behind the other 3?
They are the 3 maidens' husbands.
All very interesting, but I don't see why that would make the cook run off on Christmas Eve.
That's where the story comes in. You see, there were only 4 stones to begin with, and legend has it that one day there will be 8. He gave me a quizzical look and lit another one of my best cigars. 300 years ago, I explained, there or thereabouts, there dwelt in the village a local family with a reputation for sorcery.
Someone's cow dies and an old woman gets called a witch, I suppose.
Smith shook his head. No, there was more to it than that. It said there were 4 daughters who dabbled in love potions and curses, the usual sort of nonsense. But the complaints are well documented in the local church records. I came across them when I was doing a spot of research for my last book. Their cottage stood in what's now called 4 Maidens Meadow. You can still discern some of the foundations in the grass.
I should like to have a look at that,
said Smith, who fancies himself as something of an archaeologist when he isn't gassing butterflies. The villagers seem to have tolerated them until one of the potions went haywire, and rather a scandal. Anyway, the upshot was that a cuckolded lover took his revenge by burning down the house.
Bit harsh.
Quite, especially as all 4 daughters were in the cottage at the time. As the flames consumed them, the youngest screamed one final curse upon the village. The hapless witch promised the sisters would return every Christmas Eve to take some unlucky fellow back to the netherworld as a husband. When the house had finished burning, they discovered 4 stones in the ruins, 1 for each of the daughters.
And now there's 7 stones, so presumably they've only taken 3 husbands. That's not a remarkably high success rate over 300 years. I say, are there any more of these mince pies?
The evening wore on pleasantly enough, but by 9 o'clock his face took on a dyspeptic grimace.
I suspect I might have overdone things a bit. I shouldn't have had that last piece of Stilton.
He got to his feet and stretched.
I think I'd better walk it off before bed, or I'll be up all night grousing.
I banked up the fire, for the night had turned chill, and said I'd take the air with him. An optimistic turn of phrase, considering he insisted on taking that infernal pipe of his with him. The air had grown frosty, but not bitter, and there was little wind as we started our walk. The sky was bejewelled with stars, and a near full moon prevented the need of a lamp. We dawdled along the track and spoke little, in that comfortable way that old friends have with one another. And I suppose we had gone little more than 100 yards when Smith came to a halt.
"Do you hear that?"
I cocked an ear in the direction he faced, but I could hear nothing, not even the breath of wind through the hedgerows. No, what was it? He stood for another moment or two and then shrugged.
"I thought I heard—"
He tailed off, as if keen to keep listening. "It's probably a fox or a stoat taking a rabbit. The fields are full of them," I reassured him, amused by the sudden burst of nerves that I could feel emanating from him. He nodded, and we continued with our walk, though his attention was clearly elsewhere. After another minute, he stopped again and grabbed my arm.
"There! Surely you hear it!"
And he began to climb the high-hedged bank that separated the track from the fields.
"A woman's voice!"
Oh, very funny. I tutted at the obviousness of his prank. He ignored me and continued to scrabble up the bank. I followed him reluctantly, though I confess it intrigued me to learn how he would end his joke on me. You can imagine my surprise, therefore, when I spied a young woman lying at the base of the bank.
"I say, hello there, do you need help?" cried Smith.
"Oh, please, I've fallen and twisted my ankle." We scrambled down and helped the young lady to her feet. It proved a fruitless exercise, because she at once collapsed again.
"This is no good,"
said Smith, adopting his knight-in-shining armour voice.
"You can't walk on that. I shall have to carry you home. Do you live far?"
"Oh, I couldn't possibly," she protested.
"Nonsense."
Well, there's no arguing with Smith once he sets his mind to something, and he swept the poor lass up and into his arms. "If you're sure, sir, it's not far." "Our cottage is only just down the track," she said. I fear my impersonation does her no justice, for her voice was clear and musical. Of course, it was impossible that Smith could cart her through the hedge, so we had to trudge round the boundary, and by the time we had avoided all the ditches and other obstacles, I had completely lost my sense of direction. "Through that little gate there, sir," she said at last.
"Oh."
I caught the disappointment in Smith's voice, for though he is a confirmed bachelor, he does like to fall in love with a pretty face, and with the moonlight on her hair and the stars reflecting in her eyes, she was certainly a pleasing sight. They passed through the gate ahead of me, as a cloud swept across the moon, and I happened to glance up at the stars and realised, to my surprise, that we had come full circle. Instead of being in the village, as I had supposed, we were behind Corkscrew Cottage. Yes, there was the light from my windows, and off in the distance the glint of the sea.
"Smith!"
I shouted at him from the safety of the gate.
"This is 4 Maidens Meadow."
He carried on walking, heedless of my cries, and she urged him on. "Just a little further. We're nearly home."
"Smith! James, wake up, man! There's no cottage here!"
And I ran into the field after them, heedless of the wet grass that lashed against my legs and the brambles that tore at my clothes. She jumped from his arms and tugged at his hands, pulling him towards the spot where the solitary stone stood. Except there was no stone there. I whirled around. The other monoliths remained in their places, but I sensed a subtle shift in the air around them. The atmosphere became charged with an electricity so malevolent that I faltered. An eerie glow surrounded them, and had I seen it from the safety of my study window, I would have dismissed it as a will-o'-the-wisp. But this was no natural phenomenon. I felt, on some deep primeval level, that I was in the presence of an ancient, living wickedness. Panic gripped me and snatched away my breath, and for every second I stood there, useless and unmoving, my friend was being carried to his doom. Another cloud shrouded the moon, and the night became as black as pitch. A gust of icy wind bit into my neck, and my hands grew numb from the sudden drop in temperature. She laughed, and my blood ran cold. It was an evil noise, a hateful old crone's cackle, but it drew me from my terrified slumber, as a cat's meow might rouse a cornered mouse. I gathered my wits and tore after them.
"James, fight it! Whatever it is, fight it!" I begged him.
He was hardly moving, and the noises he made were like a man stricken with lockjaw. Yet, despite his immobility, I struggled to secure a hold on him. Whatever was affecting my friend was also causing a trembling paralysis in my own hands. I pulled at him with all my might, but I was no match for her. She had the strength of 10 men, and 10 young men at that. I felt that she was toying with us, that she could have taken us both to some god-forsaken realm of hell with a simple click of her fingers. And then I heard the ripping of cloth as she gripped his other sleeve. I let go of his arm and instead yanked solely at his jacket, tearing the back seam. She staggered backwards as the cloth gave way in her hands, and I shoved him to one side. It was like pushing granite, but as she stumbled further, he grew lighter, and I heaved my shoulder against him. His jacket split apart, freeing him from her clutches, and I bundled him away to the edge of the field. She screamed then. It was like no sound I had ever heard, nor would I care to hear it again. It is a sound that sometimes wakes me in the witching hours, and makes me fumble with shaking fingers for the light switch. I do not know how I got him back to the house, for he could barely move, and I had to prise his mouth open to get some brandy down him. We stayed close by the fire all night, and as the first light of Christmas morning filtered through the windows, he gradually recovered his senses, but not, alas, the full use of one arm. It has remained stiff and cold to this very day, as stiff and cold as stone. I have not ventured into 4 Maidens Meadow since, but every Christmas Eve night I have watched through the window with my binoculars, ready to warn any unwary travellers. The single stone is no longer visible from my study, having moved, I swear it, some 10 yards or more. But I can see her from my bedroom, and if I peer very closely, I can still see the remnants of an old tweed jacket trapped deep within the stone. Meltdown, an original short story by Miss Worm. It is an unavoidable fact that some people deserve to suffer. No, I hear you cry, that's not true. And yet you thought of someone, didn't you? Someone popped into your head when I said it. There's no need to be shy. I expect you and I are on someone's list. It would be rather vain to assume that we weren't. Spouse or parent, sibling, neighbour, boss, we're all there. All with a hidden weakness waiting to be exploited. It was my brother that popped into my head. My wonderful, talented, marvellous brother. I expect you know him. The world's greatest conductor. You must be so proud, they all say. What a thoroughly perfect chap. I used to think that too, until he killed Treacle. I shan't bore you with the details. After all, other people's tragedies are so dull. But I assure you, it was no accident. I saw him do it. Saw the joyful smirk too. He doesn't know that I know, that I've known for all these years. He assumes I swallowed his ridiculous story like all the other gullible fools. His ludicrous confection. He always has underestimated me, and that's his big mistake. You see, I know his one weakness. Chocolate. My darling brother is phobic about it. Cocolatophobia is the word for it, in case you wondered. Isn't that wonderful? Think of all the pleasure that's been denied to him. He'll never know the glorious sensation of that first velvety bite. Never feel the thrill of those endorphins coursing through his brain. Never understand the bittersweet guilt of the empty wrapper. I could almost feel sorry for him. He's always so careful. Never has chocolate in the house. Never goes to the shops. Won't even let his wife eat it, poor woman. Easter and Christmas were always about him when we were growing up. I didn't mind then. Didn't mind until after Treacle. The human mind is an odd thing. It likes to play tricks. And that's what a phobia is, really. Your own brain playing a jolly old jape. Phobias are certainly no fun. When he was at university, somebody left a Mars bar in his rooms, and he spent 3 weeks recovering in hospital. No, phobias are not to be taken lightly, not to be joked about. Well, that's okay, because I'm not joking now. It's his big night tonight, Carnegie Hall. I expect you've heard about it. I can't say that I've paid it much attention. I've been too busy. You could look it up on Google if you wanted. Isn't the internet wonderful? you can find anything you want on it. Like, for example, someone who could make a full-sized conductor's lectern out of solid chocolate, even down to white chocolate sheet music with dark chocolate notes, indistinguishable from the real thing, and all for under £1,000, £987.75 to be exact. Imagine that. And under all those hot lights too. The Cat Lady. What Lurks Behind the Shed? An original short story, written and read by Miss Worm. In a forgotten part of Sussex lies Rackham Woods, an ancient tangle of trees and superstition, where devils and monsters are as numerous as the oaks and ashes in which they are said to dwell. Deep in the heart of the woods, the trees huddle together as if even they are nervous, and the sunlight surrenders to leaf-layered twilight as the birds grow silent. Those that stray from the path talk of strange creatures that can only be seen from the corner of your eye, of unearthly whispered sounds, and of tracks left by neither man nor beast. The older village folk merely nod and change the subject when they hear these stories. They know better than to draw attention to the woods and those that are said to live within. My family has dwelt in the village of Rackham for generations, so the woods hold no fear for me. In my youth, I lost many a day beneath that Stygian canopy, tracking the wildlife and watching the birds. But then university and Oxford called, and I was not to return for 20 years. A single road passes through the woods, and when the trees are at their most impenetrable, you will see 2 high iron gates, flanked by towering brick walls, the entrance to the sprawling Gothic monstrosity that is Oakridge Psychiatric Hospital. Edward Evans had been at Oakridge for 30 years when I took up my position as Head Psychiatrist. My predecessor, Dr. Walton, handed me a box of files on his final day and said, "I suggest you take these home and read them. Our most unusual cases. Make sure you have the lights on and a strong drink in your glass, especially for Evans." My ears pricked up at the hint of mystery, but he gave no more clues. "Better yet, I'll come round and fill you in. Next Thursday? About 8, all right?" It was Wednesday evening before I had time to sit down with Dr. Walton's box of notes. I sorted through the papers and picked up the file for Evans. Until his breakdown, the highly intelligent, well-educated Edward Evans had shown no signs of mental illness. His childhood was normal and unremarkable. He had been in full-time employment since leaving university, where he excelled at English. Apart from a fixation on his dead mother and a tendency to religious mania, he was suffering from extreme allurophobia, a pronounced fear of cats. It was not that common a problem. More usual is the fear of dogs. Indeed, I myself am extremely wary of dogs, those dark, beady eyes and hot, snarling mouths with dripping teeth. Tucked inside the folder was an old cassette tape. Patient sessions are now recorded on computer, but back then the hospital was still using C90 cassettes. As far as I could see, there were only 2 such tapes amongst Dr. Walton's files. Evans, number 307, and a loose one marked Professor Carew, July 81. Fortunately, my stereo system still possesses its tape deck, and I loaded up the cassette and pressed play. Apart from some distortion here and there, The recording was in good shape for something that my younger colleagues would insist on listing as vintage. I fast-forwarded through the usual preambles.
I don't understand why I'm still here.
How have you been getting on with your writing therapy?
Asked Dr. Walton. I listened to a few minutes of swearing as I made notes.
This happened on Halloween, didn't it?
What? Yes. It started about 8 o'clock. Is this really necessary? I've said all this to the police. Those blasted kids from Willow Lane have been pestering me all evening, banging on the door, shouting trick or treat through the letterbox. They didn't give me a moment's peace. Then they swear at you when you don't give them what they want. My mother wouldn't have stood for that sort of behaviour. But I soon got fed up with all their nonsense and went out the back to put the kettle on. I hadn't yet closed the curtains, and although it was dark, the whiteness of the snow made everything perfectly visible. I couldn't quite make out what I was seeing. At first, I thought the snow was playing tricks with my eyes, but then I realised all my plants had been uprooted, even the roses my mother had planted. I ran outside and must have stood there for some minutes. Just stood there, with the snow falling on me, and me in my slippers. I thought one of the kids had come over the wall to pay me back for not answering the door. That was when I saw it. Well, at first I thought it was the cat from next door. People have them as pets. Can you believe it? Pets. In their houses. They don't understand. Why won't they listen? Devils. Devils.
You're perfectly safe here.
They're coming. You fools. They're here. They're here. They've been asleep all along, and now they're awake. They're awake. We must do something. They won't do anything. They're all in on it. Doctors. Police. Everyone. Him, he's one.
I rewound the tape and listened to it twice more, but I gleaned nothing further. I sat back in my chair and wondered what Dr. Walton would say when he visited the following day. "Hello, Dr. Walton. How's retirement treating you? Glad to be out of the rat race?" I took him into the study and poured a generous measure of scotch into a crystal tumbler for him, before adding a slosh to my mug. "It's only been 4 days. Still, wife hasn't killed me yet, so that's something, I suppose. Did you get a chance to read the Evans file?" I did, but to be frank, I didn't think there was anything particularly unusual. "Ah," he gestured to the carrier bag he'd handed me on the doorstep. I'd rather hoped it contained a box of chocolates, but upon closer inspection, I discovered a bundle of tatty exercise books. "Evans writing therapy," he said. I gave him a disapproving look. This really shouldn't leave the hospital premises. He raised an eyebrow and stared meaningfully at the files on my desk. "Point taken. Mind if I light my pipe?" "Not at all. My father used to smoke a pipe."
Did he? Did he indeed? That's very interesting. And how does that make you feel? Oh, shut up.
"Well, you haven't come out on a rainy night to psychoanalyse me. Tell me about Evans. There's obviously more to it." I watched his hands as he filled his pipe, carefully selecting the fragrant shreds of tobacco before he pressed them into the bowl. His tamper caught the light, sending sparkling beams skittering across the wall like silver butterflies.
"Pass me those exercise books,"
he said, and I dragged my attention back to my guest.
"Got yourself a drink? You'll need it." Unfortunately, the majority of his records were lost in a fire, but these notebooks of his, these survived.
"A fire? Did one of the patients—"
"No, they think it was rats. Well, something got in and chewed through a wire."
He shuffled through the notebooks and picked one out. The red cover was scuffed and stained with curled-up edges from repeated readings. For an instant I was transported back to school and the unmistakable smell of hot classrooms stuffed with bored teenagers.
"You've listened to the tape?"
I nodded.
"Here we are then. If you recall, Evans is standing in the garden. I remember the whiteness of the snow as it fell. It had begun to settle, and already the garden was disappearing into an unfamiliar world
of indistinct, distorted forms. The tattered remains of my plants lay strewn about, their dying leaves already turning black from cold, already rotting as they gave up the last of their life force. I was upset about my mother's roses the most. New bushes could replace them, but it wouldn't be her hands which dug into the earth and planted them, nor would I ever share the same sweet perfume that she had once enjoyed. A suffocating cloud of despair fell upon me, my mind dwelling on the idea that her blood, unnoticed on a thorn, had dried in the summer sun, to then be absorbed by the plant itself. I fell to my knees in the snow and gathered the plants to my chest. The thorns pricked me and tore at my skin, but I delighted in it. Every drop of crimson that stained the snow, a reminder that I, too, was of my mother's blood. But then, that innate sixth sense which remains in all of us lifted the hackles on my neck. I was being watched. Someone, somewhere, was watching. I turned my head slowly, and from the corner of my eye, I saw the easy, languorous stretch of an animal rising from sleep. A large, black tom. But no, this was too substantial for a cat, and no dog ever moved thus. It occurred to me that it was the vandal, the snubbed trick-or-treater, the desecrator of my plants, and that his bizarre cat-like appearance was caused by a Halloween costume. I was about to shout a rebuke when he turned towards me. We locked eyes, and my soul quivered. This was no child in fancy dress. His eyes burnt into the darkness, catching what light there was and turning it to flame. His sleek coat rose until he grew to twice his size, and behind him his tail trembled, as thick as a man's arm, but as lithe and mobile as a snake covered in silken hair. My reason rebelled against the thought, but as those eyes seared into mine, it dawned on me that I was staring at a fiendish hybrid, some devilish mixture of cat and human, awoken on this heathen night, and secure in the ungodly paganism of All Hallows' Eve, free to walk abroad. Kneeling there, surrounded by blood-spattered snow, the full malignant potency of that unholy festival pressed upon me. My senses must have failed me in my shock, for I suddenly realised that the beast had gone without my noticing. I struggled to my feet and staggered towards the place where he had rested. My feet and legs were numb from cold, and my hands and arms still bled from the thorns, but I paid them no heed. I must find the beast and destroy it. He had lain in the lee of the woodshed, and a patch of snowless earth soon showed me where. I felt the ground. Yes, it was still warm. I had not been insensible for any real length of time. Tracks led away to the rear of the wood store. The impressions were like nothing I had ever seen. They were the size and shape of a man's foot, and with a man's heel, but ending with the 4 rounded toes of a cat's paw. Sunk deep into the snow, they left distinctive imprints for me to follow. Quickly, I made my way behind the shed. The footprints, paw prints, whatever they were, ended in a dense patch of brambles and briars between the shed and the back wall. I examined the brickwork. There was no sign the beast had scrambled over. No scratches from claws, and the freshly fallen snow lay undisturbed on the top. I grabbed a stick and stabbed amongst the brambles. The briars ripped at my clothes, and my skin suffered yet more gashes, but I was determined to beat the tangle back. The ground beneath was trampled flat, as if many feet had been there. The first needles of fear pricked at me. Was there more than one beast? What devilment had I stumbled upon? In the distance, the church clock struck 11. So late already. Only 1 hour left of this accursed Halloween. I doubled my efforts and drove the briars back, toiling until my sweat turned icy in the frigid air. There, tight against the edge of the shed and burrowing beneath, was a yawning hole. Had I discovered the monster's lair? I rocked back on my heels and thought. I was ill-equipped to tackle these creatures. My shirt sleeves were drenched and icy, my slippers sodden by the snow, and perhaps more importantly, I had no weapon. In a fevered hurry, I sprinted back to the house, whereupon I changed my clothes and fetched a torch. After a moment's hesitation, I unlocked my mother's bureau. My father's old service revolver was safely inside, untouched since the war. It had been kept as an insurance policy against invaders. Well, what was this if not an invasion, or at least a potential one? The Webley was reassuringly solid in my hand and bolstered my courage. I had been in the house for not yet 5 minutes and had kept watch, as much as I was able, on the back of the shed from the windows. The creature had not surfaced, from that entrance to its burrows at any rate. A glance at the clock showed me it was already 20 to 12. How could this be? The church clock had surely only just struck 11. Had I not heard it with my own ears? I glanced again. 10 to 12. Could these devils alter time? Were they speeding up the night to thwart me in my mission to destroy them? Every moment was vital, and I rushed from the house, torch in hand and revolver tucked into waistband. The snow had continued to fall in my absence. It was thick and unyielding against my feet, and it had covered all evidence of the demon's vandalism. Even my blood, those crimson drops of life, had disappeared beneath the blanket of white. I had no time to waste and hurried to the end of the garden to confront the monster in his den. The brambles were as I had left them, though the snow had covered the tracks on the trampled earth. I scraped it away with shivering hands until the hole was exposed again. No more than the width of a man's shoulders, the torchlight revealed a tunnel leading beneath the shed. I pressed my ear to its entrance. From deep within came the scrabbling of movement, and to my horror, the unmistakable sound of young mewling. My heart raced faster than it has ever done before, and I was half inclined to turn tail and flee. Yet what of the world if I let these monstrosities live? Pushing the torch before me, I squeezed my head and shoulders into the hole. The entrance was beaten earth, but as I shuffled my way farther through that god-forsaken passage, my torchlight illuminated the walls. They were covered with newspaper, scavenged no doubt from nearby dustbins, and plastered against the tunnel sides. It was too dark to make out the dates, but the headlines told me all I needed to know. Close by the entrance I saw recent news, but with each foot I descended, I travelled back in time. I passed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Falklands War, the assassination of Kennedy, the coronation of Elizabeth. All were pasted there. A cold sweat leapt to my brow. This tunnel, this den, was decades old. The air grew warmer as I writhed and twisted my way down, stomach and back both crammed against the tunnel, and the crisp scent of snow was replaced by the sweetness of milk, but a milk that had been tainted with a strange, fish-like odour. A wretched snuffling and suckling came from nearby. My stomach turned, and I muttered the Lord's Prayer. I couldn't risk discovery, so I switched off my torch and continued on my ghastly journey in the pitch black. They were the worst minutes of my life. At last, I felt the tunnel ease its pressure on my shoulders as it widened. The stench of contaminated milk assailed my senses. It enveloped me, pressing against my skin and burrowing deep within my nostrils. Wet sounds accompanied the warmth, a contented puling and sucking. Within this came a rhythmic, rasping scrape. Panic rose in my chest. My breathing grew laboured, and it was all I could do to not be violently, hideously sick. I could take the darkness no more, and I flicked on my torch. Its beam revealed a large cavern, again lined with newspapers, and a page declaring victory in Europe faced me, though I scarcely took it in. In front of me, not 6 feet away from my prone, defenceless form, was a monstrous beast. The size of a small woman, it lay in a bed of dried grasses, blinking rapidly against the unexpected light. Smooth, tawny fur covered its cat-like form, all save for the head and hands. Its face turned towards me, and it was the face of a woman, soft and rosy, with human eyes of green. Her hands, human in every detail, held a smaller creature. I had surprised her in the act of licking it clean. Her tongue, pale pink in the torchlight, was grotesquely long and covered with hooked white barbs. She had no covering, and with rising alarm I realised the origin of the noises I had heard. From her 6 human breasts, she was suckling her young. I cried out in fear, and her abominable offspring ceased in their mewling and faced me. 6 of them, all with different atrocities upon them. Some had the faces of human children. Others had human bodies but the head of a cat. My hands scrambled for my gun, but it wasn't there. It must have fallen from my pocket in the tunnel. The Catwoman growled, and her vile progeny bared their appalling fangs. Her kittens scattered, and she stalked towards me, tail swishing in the torchlight, as if I were a mouse. My fingers clawed frantically at the earth as I retreated feet first up the tunnel. Earth trickled from the roof of the burrow as I crashed against it in my fury to escape. Was I to be buried alive with these horrors? I scrabbled on, and with her eyes fixed on mine, those dreadful burning eyes, she retrieved her terrible brood and slunk back to the chamber. Finally, I reached the sweet air of God's blessed creation, and as I stumbled away, the church struck 12. I fell into the snow and was found there some hours later. There was no sign of the black beast I had first seen. There must be another way out of their warren.
Dr. Walton closed the exercise book. What do you make of that? I looked up from my notes. My immediate thought is he's suffered some sort of medical episode and became delirious after falling in the snow. It would explain the sensation of lost time. Walton nodded. Is there any local folklore that may have influenced him? I understand your family has been in this area for a very long time. Yes, we've been here for generations. I sipped my drink slowly and returned my mug to the table, where it caught the doctor's eye. Milk? Got yourself a stomach ulcer? Midnight? Already? I feel like I've only just got here. Well, I must be off. I hope I haven't given you nightmares. Nothing worse than a bad night's sleep. Don't worry, a full 8 hours has never been for me. I much prefer to nap. I stood up, making sure my sleeves were pulled well down past my wrists. Well, good night then, Dr. Felix. Enjoy your evening. My eyes strayed to the ball of wool in the corner. Oh, I shall. It's Only Once a Year. A Christmas love story, written and read by Miss Worm. Next year, she thought, I'll not bother with all this food. Get something nice from Marks and Spencer's instead. Something a bit different. Would you like that? She shouted through to the living room. Make a change, wouldn't it? She wiped her hands on the tea towel and went to check on him. Only half an hour to the Queen's speech. He always enjoys that. Well, it'd be the King's speech this year. Be funny without the Queen, she said. I can't get used to saying the King. He didn't reply. He was glued to the telly, as usual, with his paper hat all wonky, bless him. He always said that Christmas dinner and the telly are the best bits of Christmas Day. Well, he worked hard enough the rest of the year. Let him have the day how he wanted it. She cast a worried glance at him. He was looking thinner. Oh, blow Marks and Spencer's. If he wanted to see a good spread on the table, why not? It was only once a year. And one year it would be your last Christmas together. And you never know, do you? You never know when. He was definitely getting thin. No, that wasn't the right word. Not thin. Transparent. Yes, that's it. Transparent. This year she could see the telly right through him, and she could only see his legs if she looked at them from the corner of her eye. Well, that's probably to be expected. After all, he'd been dead for 12 years, and you can't expect him to haunt you forever, can you? Even if it is only one day a year. The Chalk Pits, an original story written and read by Miss Worm. I met Richard Phillips at boarding school, St Swithin's Preparatory for Boys. Dickie, we all called him back then, none of this Sir Richard business. We were, 8 or 9, I suppose, and we instantly became inseparable. Our fathers both travelled for the Foreign Office, and consequently we hardly saw our parents from one year to the next. Not that we cared. It was the late 60s and you just got on with things then. We were just ordinary lads. There was certainly no hint of the millionaire playboy he was to become. It was the summer of 76, that glorious endless summer, and we were 15. We'd been packed off to Sussex for the holidays and were staying with Dickie's relatives. A wonderfully mad old eccentric called Aunt Mabel, who had a pet monkey. Anyway, that's by the by. It was what happened that summer that's important. It's commonly thought that Richard's money came from his family, but they didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. True, they had a large estate in Sussex, about 500 acres, with a Tudor manor house, etc., etc. But the place had gone to rack and ruin since the Great War. Nobody wanted to work at the big houses, so it just gradually decayed until it was sold off an acre or so at a time for a pittance. When we were there, the house was more or less falling down around Aunt Mabel's ears, and there was only one chap working the gardens. Hobden, I think his name was. I suppose he might still be alive. He'd have to be in his 90s if he is. Anyway, it was towards the middle of August, and the countryside was parched. Everything was a golden brown, and the cracks in the earth were as wide as your hand. Even the roads had melted, and the streams and rifes that usually flowed through the grounds had all dried up. Dickie was obsessed with fishing at the time, and he got the idea in his head that there was a huge pike trapped in the local quarry. It wasn't a particularly deep body of water, 30 feet or so, but they say you can drown in 6 inches. Well, there were warning signs up everywhere in the woods. Keep out, danger, that sort of thing. I don't know if you're familiar with that part of Sussex, but it's littered with little quarries. Chalk pits, the locals call them, you know, where they used to excavate the chalk. Of course, that was a few hundred years ago now, and the trees and heath have made a good fist of reclaiming the place. You've got to be careful when you're out walking. or you could fall into one of the pits before you know it. Some of the furnaces and kilns are still up there. It's a very interesting place. Well, Dickie and I were lazing about the grounds and pestering the gardener, and Dickie tells him about this pike he thinks is lurking in the chalk pit. Hobden came over all shifty and tried to scare us from going up there. Spun us some old yarn about witchcraft and devil worship. Though, to be honest, it's where I got the idea for my first bestseller, The Chalk Rope. Well, of course, Hobden's stories just made the place all the more enticing to two teenage lads. Look, might I be allowed to smoke? I pointed at the no smoking sign. The police inspector nodded. Of course, Mr. Leverett. This isn't a formal interview, and I'm sure we can make some allowances after all that's happened. Thanks. I took my time sorting out my pipe and worked out how I was going to tell the story without making myself look ridiculous. Sorry, would you mind? I gestured to the lighter with my bandaged hand. He lit my pipe for me, and I settled back in the chair. I'd heard one of the policemen call it Soft Interview Room 1, and it wasn't like anything you'd see on the television. Armchairs, coffee table, cushions. There were even potted plants. The inspector got up and poured himself another coffee. You were saying, sir? Hobden told us no one would go near the place at night, especially on a full moon. Of course, we'd grown up watching Christopher Lee dashing about after scantily clad maidens, and thought we'd be rescuing some lithesome Jane Seymour type from the clutches of evil. We could hardly contain our excitement, but we had to wait a week till the next full moon. In the meantime, Dickie rummaged through the family library and managed to find some old book in Latin. It was no use to me. I'm hopeless at languages. But Dickie insisted it was some sort of spell book. Grimoire, he called it. Endless riches, unlimited power, fame, sex, love, whatever you wanted, could all be yours. It was bound in the softest leather, I remember that, and he insisted that it was human skin. I took it with a handful of salt. He's a dreadful leg puller. Was a dreadful leg puller. Well, he spent more and more time reading this book until I couldn't get him to leave the library at all. He'd completely forgotten about the pike by that time. Every conversation became about money and power, what he would do if only he had the opportunity. It was the usual adolescent fantasy. Captain England on the cricket field, marry a model, make a million. On the night of the full moon, we had no problems getting out of the house after dark. It was as hot at midnight as during the day, and the windows were wide open all night. Different times, I suppose. And I gave him a rueful smile. It made it very easy for the two of us to sneak out. We made our way through the grounds of the manor to the edge of Rackham Woods. Dickie was the most pent-up I'd ever seen him, but by then, frankly, I was a bit bored by the whole thing and convinced Hobden had made the entire story up. After half an hour or so of aimless wandering about, Dickie swore he saw a light through the trees, so we set off in pursuit. The ground is almost pure chalk up there, so the path was easy to see. And this track took us to the edge of a clearing at the bottom of the chalk pit. I shall never forget it. The sky was as black as velvet, and there wasn't a breath of air. It was as if time itself had stopped, and the laws of science and the laws of man no longer applied. Something else had got the upper hand. You could feel it, almost hear it. Some magnetic change in the atmosphere. An anticipation. We hid in the trees and watched. I've never seen anything so beautiful, so mesmerising, and yet so frightening in my entire life. 13 figures cloaked in black formed a circle. The towering walls of the chalk pit loomed over them, so brilliantly white that they were imbued in an unearthly luminosity. The coven that Hobden had spoken of had congregated there to perform some ungodly rite. In the centre of their circle was a gigantic black dog, and though the night was hot, his breath rose in smoky coils around him. The figures shifted suddenly, exchanging positions as if taking part in some demonic dance, and all the while this dog sat there, staring up at the moon. Dickie shuffled over to me until he was so close his breath lifted the hairs on my neck. "They're standing on all points of a pentacle," he whispered. "I recognise it from that book." His eyes were wide and his breath was growing faster. "We should go," I said. "We shouldn't watch, it might be bad luck or something." "You go if you want. I want to hear what they're saying." And he moved closer. A twig snapped beneath his foot and all 13 spun towards us. I was up in a flash and sprinting back along the path, but Dickie stayed where he was. "Come on," I shouted, and I turned to see 2 of them grab him and march him into the clearing. I didn't know what to do. With hindsight, I should have gone for help, but instead I stopped and let myself be taken. The coven had marked out a pentacle on the floor. That's a 5-pointed star, a pentagram, surrounded by a circle. And they pushed us into the centre, with the dog. I thought they were going to set the thing on us. I can't tell you how terrified I was. But it didn't even glance at us. Dickie grabbed my arm. "Don't worry, Tony. Just follow my movements and repeat everything I say." He started talking gibberish, don't ask me what, some sort of Latinised doggerel, and waving his arms about. It had no effect on the coven. They just stood there in total silence. But the dog was fascinated. Couldn't take its eyes off him. It stood up, and like an electric current beneath its skin, its hackles rose and it came towards us. It paid no attention to me. Everything about it, this giant dog, was fixated on Dickie. He spoke to it in that strange, unintelligible language, and the beast simply lay down at his feet. And then the figure at the south point set something on fire. The smoke spiralled up into the night sky, and they began to chant. Softly at first, little more than a whisper, and then it rose and swelled until I could feel it. It pulsed in my chest, and then I realised that my heartbeat had changed. My heart was beating in time with their rhythm, and as their words changed time, so did my heart. Don't ask me how they did it. Perhaps it was some sort of hypnosis, but the worst of it was that Dickie was conducting it. He stood there in the centre of that infernal pentacle with the dog lying at his feet and directed their chanting. It was madness. Even the smoke, you'll think I've lost my mind, even the smoke was following his gestures. "Quick, Tony," he said. "You must do as I do, or they'll never let you out alive." And I'm ashamed to say I did it. I raised my arms like he had and repeated the words, meaningless though they were to me. The song grew faster until I thought my heart would burst, and then, I swear to you, I heard drums and flutes, music like I've never heard before. Then, all at once, Dickie dropped his arms and everything stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise, and all 13 fell to the ground. They lay in the shape of the pentagram, the star, and all were pointing to Richard. He raised his arms again, slowly this time, and they started humming. It was a ghastly droning that somehow got inside you, that made your bones vibrate until you thought they would break. He moved his fingers almost imperceptibly, and with every movement the pitch of the droning changed, yet they were all still face down upon the ground. They couldn't see him, but they followed his commands. I'm sorry. May I have another cup of tea?" The inspector rose and filled the kettle with water. I fear I flinched at the click of the switch as he turned it on. "I'm sorry. My nerves." I fumbled in my jacket pocket for my pills. It's been a difficult week. We sat in silence as we waited for the kettle to boil, and I wondered what he made of it all. He handed me a cup wordlessly. Thank you. I took a sip of the scalding tea.
What happened then, Mr. Leverett?
They began to crawl towards us, not on their hands and knees, but completely prostrate, face still against the ground. They moved by shifting their shoulders. They were like giant slugs. Their black, writhing bodies against the white of the chalk disgusted me. And all the time that horrific humming continued. I had to get away from it. Dickie was buzzing, as if he was taming a wild horse or landing a prize-winning fish. I couldn't take any more and I ran for it. I was a complete wreck by the time I got back to the manor house. My nerves had had it, and I'm ashamed to say that I didn't alert the house. I just got into bed fully clothed and lay there, shivering with fear. He came in just before sunrise, at about 5:30 at that time of year. He said he'd joined their sect or coven or whatever it was. The Brethren, he kept calling them. They'd performed some abomination of a ritual and granted him 49 years of whatever he wanted.
49? What's the significance of 49?
7 times 7. Apparently 7 has some sort of diabolical significance. I'm afraid I didn't really take it all in. But the thing is, he actually believed it. He was convinced. You can't believe it, I said to him. It's a load of mumbo-jumbo. No, I don't believe it, he replied. I know it to be so. There was something about the way he said it, so calmly, so dispassionately, that chilled me. I knew then that he was lost. I barely saw him for the rest of that summer. He spent his days with that infernal book, and his nights... Well, I suspect he spent his nights in the chalk pit. He left school almost immediately. Just chucked it in. No exams, nothing. We kept in touch sporadically, but he couldn't understand why I didn't want anything to do with it. Every time he had some triumph, he would get a message to me. You see, Tony, it's not too late for you. That's all it ever said.
And he put all his success down to that?
I nodded. Everything. His money, his sport, his luck with women. I trailed off at that. Even my own achievements he put down to my being there.
I understand you've had a very accomplished writing career, sir.
5 bestsellers and 2 screenplays, but it took me years to do it.
And you'd had no other contact before he reappeared in your life in June, wasn't it?
Well, it's...
Sir?
It's a bit... To be frank, the closer we got to the 49th year, I think it must have been playing on his mind. I suppose that's what happens when you invest everything in a superstition. He'd begun to send me things on what he felt were important dates.
I don't suppose you've kept any of them, sir?
Good grief, no. They became increasingly bizarre and, well, to put it bluntly, unsettling. The final package contained a small burr walnut box, exquisitely made, beautifully polished, and the inside was lined with dark, ruby-coloured velvet. The inspector looked at me expectantly. It held a phial of blood. I'm afraid I threw it away. Naturally, I assumed he was having some sort of breakdown, that the decades of excesses had caught up with him.
Yet you never thought to tell anyone.
Well, what could I say? He was England's greatest ever cricketer, the most popular knight of the realm. His last wife was a minor royal. How could I denounce him as a madman who put all his success down to some ridiculous pantomime he witnessed as a youth?
I see your point, sir. And then he came to your house?
He did. He just turned up without warning. Laura was immediately taken with him. He was still very charismatic and arrived with 24 red roses for Laura and a bottle of the finest malt for me. He said he'd heard the reviews for my latest book, The Bitter Circle, and as he happened to be nearby, thought he'd come and congratulate me. We saw a lot of him after that. He was very generous. Lunches and dinners at the top restaurants, and always with some little gift for Laura. I say little. Not sure if the average man would call a diamond bracelet little, but that was just Richard. He had a reputation for impulsive generosity. I never guessed. Then his behaviour slowly changed. The closer we got to August, to the anniversary of the ritual, the more he became nervous, twitchy. A sort of barely suppressed excitement came over him. And then yesterday, Laura had gone to stay with her mother up in Oxford earlier in the week. My mother-in-law had had a nasty dose of flu, and Laura wanted to help her convalesce. I didn't question it for a moment. And then yesterday, I came downstairs for breakfast and found him sitting in the living room. "Laura and I are in love," he said. Just like that. Well, I was stunned. I'd no inkling at all. I sank into the chair opposite him and just sat there. And then I felt a surge of anger. How dare he? How dare this man just walk into my house and announce that he was taking my wife? They'd only known each other for 2 minutes. I swore at him for a bit and then said, "I've no intention of giving her up." "I don't expect you to give her up," he said. And then I noticed the box next to him. It was made from the same sort of walnut as the box containing the blood. Dark and beautiful, but bigger. About this big. I held my hands out to show the inspector. "I know, Mr. Leverett. We recovered it from the scene." "Oh, yes. Yes, of course." He just sat there until I ran out of steam. Well, you can't really hit a man when he's sitting down, can you? But believe me, I wanted to. So I'm afraid I threatened him a bit. I warned him, if you persist in this charade, I shall tell the papers about the chalk pits. Really, Tony? You think anyone would believe you? And even if they did, wouldn't they pick over your own illustrious career? The bestsellers, the screenplays, the awards, the MBE, the beautiful young wife. "I suppose she's not really at her mother's?" I asked. "And you're not going to tell me where she is?" "No point, Tony," he said, and I asked him what he meant. He picked up the box then and opened it. The lid was towards me, so I couldn't see what was in it at that point, but I could make out the same blood-red velvet lining. "There's no point in you knowing, because you're never going to see her again." And he closed the box. In his hand was a gun, just lying there in the palm of his hand. He wasn't pointing it at me or anything. My heart almost stopped. Perhaps that was the intention, to frighten me to death. "You can't mean to shoot me." I could barely get the words out. "Good grief, no. Nothing so predictable. I'm afraid you're going to shoot yourself." "Don't be ridiculous. You'd never get away with it. Even if you wear gloves, the police aren't fools. They have tests for gunshot residue. You misunderstand, Tony. I shan't even be here. Can't you hear it? Listen." And he cocked his head to one side. "The beat of the brethren." I couldn't hear anything at first, but then the sound of drums started up. It was the same drumming we'd heard all those years ago in the chalk pits. Somehow, as I listened, the pitch changed, growing lower until I couldn't hear it, but I knew it was still there. It throbbed and pulsed as if it were alive, as if it had crawled into me and somehow found its way into my very being, as if it were trying to control me. I couldn't bear the vibration, and then the flutes began. I covered my ears, but the flutes increased the pitch, higher and shriller. It was like needles inside my head. Then he clicked his fingers, and it stopped. I can stop and start the music any time I want. There'll be no peace, Tony. No peace until you decide to end it. He was so calm, as if we were talking about a new car or his latest investment strategy. Well, I took my chance and I leapt at him. We struggled for the gun. I got it off him, but he wrenched my hand back and smashed it against the wall. That must be when it broke. I didn't feel it at the time. Adrenaline, I suppose. I paused and fumbled at my pipe. "And then the gun went off, did it, sir?" asked the inspector. "Yes. I tried CPR, but it was obvious he was dead. The bullet went straight through his heart." The inspector looked away as I struggled to regain my composure. Obviously I didn't believe all the brethren nonsense, but I don't understand about the music. How could he make me hear the music? "We found a hidden player, sir, voice activated, and programmed to play a low resonance frequency known to cause distress to humans." Good grief! He must have hidden it when I was out of the house. "I'm afraid not, sir. It only has your wife's fingerprints on it. I'm sorry, sir, it seems your wife was involved in the plot to kill you. We'll do our best to find her." I let that sink in. There didn't seem to be much to say to that. Will I have to be prosecuted?" "I very much doubt it. I'll be recommending that the Crown Prosecution Service sees things as self-defence." "And the business with the brethren?" "I know he tried to kill me, but I'd rather not tarnish the man's reputation. It would be very embarrassing for the establishment, what with his links to the government and the royal family. There's bound to be questions." The inspector sighed. "I think we can keep all that between ourselves, sir. I imagine the fewer questions I ask, the better." I nodded. That was my feeling entirely. "Your wife's credit card was used to purchase 2 tickets for the ferry to France. We'll soon find her." Doubtful, I thought. Not when her body is in a suitcase at the bottom of Rackham Wood's chalk pond. It had been a hell of a job to get the cheating cow's fingerprints on that recorder. In the end, I had to break her fingers. Shame she was too dead to notice. "Devil worship," the inspector shook his head. "I would never have believed it." But he did. I'd worried I'd taken it a step too far, but it just proves that there really is one born every minute. Wasps, an original short story by Miss Worm. It was the hottest summer on record, so they said, and I could well believe it. He spent most of it lying in the garden, in his green football shirt, slowly cooking himself like an early Christmas turkey basted in cheap lager. But as long as the beer was in steady supply, he was docile, and lucky for me, his fists were too. One day, at the end of June, hotter even than the days before, I was topping up the bird bath when I spotted a wasp struggling in the water. It had fallen in, poor thing, and I rushed to find a stick to help it out.
"Just kill it, you silly cow. They're a bloody nuisance."
"I can't. They have such little time, only days really. It's not up to me to play God." I fished the wasp out and helped it onto a leaf. One crooked antenna hung uselessly at the side of its head. "Poor you," I whispered.
"There's a nest in the loft,"
he said, and a sneer came over his drunken face.
"I'll go up and kill 'em later."
The nest had been there all summer without bothering us, and I knew he was only saying it to upset me. But the more I thought about those lives, those fleeting, work-filled lives, the more I pleaded with him. His temper fermented in the unrelenting heat, bubbling up and frothing, until he dragged me indoors, pushing me up the ladder into the attic, keen for me to witness his petty destruction. It was stifling up there, a pitch-black, hellish oven, as if something had sucked all the oxygen away, and the roasting darkness pressed against me like a threatening, inescapable blanket.
"Come here, you."
He shoved me against the wall.
"I'll show you who's God in this house."
He staggered, half crouching, between the joists and beams, and shone his torch at the nest. I grabbed his arm and his hand scraped against the joist. A fat splinter pierced his flesh, and the wood disappeared deep into his skin. He pulled it out, and a drop of blood, almost black in the gloom, splattered against the nest. Instantly I knew what was coming. His fist smashed into the side of my head, and 1,000 glowing stars lit up the attic. A wave of nausea overtook me, and I hung my head low, battling against the sickness. My gaze fell upon his old hockey stick lying at my feet, so I picked it up, and I hit him. And I kept on hitting him. I lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling. The windows were open wide, and there was no avoiding the heat. I ignored the soft buzzing at first, but as it drew closer, I turned over. A wasp had settled on his pillow, and as it crawled towards me, I laughed like I hadn't done in years. But he couldn't stay up there forever, not in this heat. The neighbours were bound to notice the smell. Supposing he seeped through the ceiling. It took 2 days for me to screw up my courage, and then, armed with a roll of bin bags and the electric carving knife, I lifted the hatch, expecting the stench of rotting meat to strike me. Nothing. I took off my COVID mask and stuck my head through the hatchway. Not even a hint. Christ! Was he still alive? I ducked down in alarm, and the loft hatch slammed. No, he couldn't be. But if he was... I gripped the carving knife and forced myself back up the ladder into the sweltering black void. The wasps droned in the shadows, and my rapid heartbeats formed a rhythm with them. I saw his foot first, lying at a weird angle with the shoe half off. A single wasp crawled across his sock. Sweat drenched my back, and my fingers shook as I clamped my mask closer to my face. Slowly, I swung the torch further up his body, expecting him to be nothing but putrefying meat alive with maggots. The buzz of the wasps intensified as the light hit them, but they didn't come near me. They were too busy eating what was left of him. I noticed a new sound, gnawing. They were stripping his skin from the bones, one minuscule mouthful at a time. They'd made short work of his arms. Patches of bone glinted white in the torchlight, and the sleeves of his t-shirt twitched and writhed as they hurried back and forth, seeking any tiny morsel of flesh they'd missed. They swarmed over his head 10 deep or more, until there was just a seething mass of bodies where there had once been a face, where there had once been eyes, a nose, a mouth. Had he been dead when the first wasp had ventured into his nostrils? Or had he felt, in the twilight of his consciousness, hundreds of industrious feet scratching their way upwards into his soft, moist brain? My knees buckled at that, and I sat on the floor with a thump. As I did so, my torchlight landed on the nest. It was just paper and wood, for the most part, all except the central chamber, which had a bright green lining. It was then that I saw her, the Queen, watching me from high up on one of the joists. She was 3 inches long, with one crooked, useless antenna. "Thank you," I whispered. For nearly a month I listened to them. Their constant murmuring lulled me to sleep at night, and during the day I watched them in the garden. Some evenings I went up into the attic and kept them company. I marvelled as entire generations fed on him. The Queen flourished, and soon she was the length and breadth of my forearm, and by the end of the month she was 2 feet long and almost as tall. There was not much left of him by then, and a new problem confronted me. At first I bought them pork from the supermarket, but it never satisfied them for long, and they became more demanding as the Queen grew. She'd knock on the loft hatch, tap, 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 to let me know when they were hungry. It was happening more and more. On quiet nights I heard her feet skittering across the attic floor. She'd pause above my bed, and I wondered, sometimes, if I would ever end up as lunch. Something would have to be done. Just before Christmas, I switched on the news. A police inspector looked into the camera.
Thank you. Our officers have been very successful in ridding the town of drug dealers,
He said. And I laughed. Laughed like I haven't laughed in months. The Coat by A.E.D. Smith. I am quite aware that the other fellows in the office regard me as something of an oddity, as being rather a queer bird, in fact. Well, of course, a man who happens to be of a studious disposition, who dislikes noise and prefers his own company to that of empty-headed companions, and who, moreover, is compelled by defective vision to wear thick glasses, is always liable to be thus misjudged by inferior minds. And ordinarily, I treat the opinion of my colleagues with the contempt it deserves. But at this particular moment, I was beginning to think that perhaps, after all, there might be something to be said for their view. For though I might still repudiate the queer bird part of the business, undoubtedly I was an ass, a first-class chump. Otherwise I should have been spending my holidays in a nice comfortable way with the rest of the normal world, listening to the Pierrots or winking at the girls on the promenade of some seaside resort at home, instead of having elected to set out alone on this idiotic push-bike tour of a little-known part of France. Drenched, hungry and lost, a stranger in a strange land, dispiritedly pushing before me a heavily laden bicycle with a gashed tyre, such was the present result of my asinine choice. The storm had overtaken me miles from anywhere, on a wild road over a spur of the Vosges, and for nearly 2 hours I had trudged through the pelting rain without encountering a living soul or the least sign of human habitation. And then, at long last, rounding a bend, I glimpsed just ahead of me the chimney pots and gables of a fair-sized house. It was a lonely, desolate-looking place, standing amid a clump of trees a little way back from the road, and somehow, even at a distance, it did not convey a very inviting impression. Nevertheless, in that wilderness, it was a welcome enough sight, and in the hope of finding temporary shelter and possibly a little badly needed refreshment, I quickened my pace towards it. 200 yards brought me to the entrance gates, and here I suffered a grievous disappointment, for the roofless porter's lodge, the dilapidated old gates hanging askew on their hinges, and the overgrown drive beyond, plainly indicated that the place was no longer inhabited. I speedily comforted myself, however, with the reflection that in the circumstances even a deserted house was not to be despised as a refuge. Once under cover of some kind, I might make shift to wring out my drenched clothing and repair my damaged mount. And without further ado, I pushed my bicycle up the long-neglected drive and reached the terrace in front of the house itself. It proved to be an old chateau, half smothered in creepers and vines that had long gone wild, and judging by the carved stone coat of arms over the main entrance, had once been occupied by a person of some quality. Mounted on a pedestal on either side of the iron-studded front door stood a rusty carronade, trophies, probably, of some long-forgotten war in which the former occupier had played a part. Most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was evident that the place had stood empty for many years. I tried the front door, and to my surprise it was unfastened, and a thrust of my shoulder sent it creaking grudgingly back on its hinges. My nostrils, as I stepped into the dim, wide hall, were at once assailed by the stale, disagreeable odour of rotting woodwork and mouldy hangings and carpets. For a moment or two I stood peering uncertainly about me, with a slight feeling of eeriness that one usually experiences when entering an old, empty house. Facing me was a broad staircase with a long stained glass window, almost opaque with dirt and cobwebs at its head. I mounted the stairs, and throwing open the first door at hand, found myself looking into a spacious, handsomely furnished room that had evidently once been the chief apartment of the house, though long neglect and disuse had now reduced it to a sorry state. The ornate cornice hung here and there in strips, and in one corner the plaster of the ceiling had come down altogether. Green mould covered the 18th century furniture. Curtains and draperies hung in tatters, and one half of the once beautiful old Persian carpet, from a point near the door right across to the fireplace, was overspread by an evil-smelling, bright orange fungus. The fireplace gave me an idea. Could I but find fuel, I might light a fire, make myself a hot drink and get my clothes properly dried. A little searching in the outbuildings discovered a sufficient quantity of old sticks to serve my purpose, and with a bundle of them under my coat, I re-entered the house and briskly made my way upstairs again. But on the threshold of the big room, without quite knowing why, I suddenly checked. It was as though my legs, of their own volition, had all at once become reluctant to carry me further into the apartment, as if something quite outside of me were urging me to turn about and retreat. I laid the sticks down at my feet, and for a moment or two stood there uncertainly in the doorway. I was beginning to sense some subtle suggestion of danger in the atmosphere of the place. Everything was apparently just as I had left it, yet I had an uneasy sort of feeling that during my brief absence something evil had entered that room and left it again. I am neither a nervous nor a superstitious person, yet I found myself, a moment later, rather shamefacedly picking up my sticks and moving back towards the head of the stairs. Actually, it was not so much fear as a vague precautionary sense of uneasiness that prompted me. It had occurred to me that perhaps I might feel more comfortable if I remained nearer to the front door and made my fire in one of the rooms on the ground floor. It was an idiotic fancy, I know, but if anything queer did happen, and I had to make a sudden bolt for it, I could get out quicker that way. It was on this second descent of the stairs, as I faced the light from the open front door, that I suddenly noticed something that pulled me up with a decided start. Running up the centre of the staircase, and quite fresh in the thick dust, was a broad, broken sort of track, exactly as though someone had recently trailed up an empty sack or something of that nature. From the foot of the staircase, I traced this track across the hall to a spot immediately below an old, moth-eaten coat that hung from one of a row of coat pegs on the opposite wall, and then I saw that similar tracks traversed the hall in various directions, some terminating before the doors on either side, others leading past the foot of the stairs to the rear regions of the house, but all seeming to radiate from the same point below the coat pegs. And the queerest thing about it all was that of footprints, other than my own, there was not a sign. Uneasiness once more assailed me. The house appeared to be uninhabited, and yet, plainly, someone, or something, had recently been in the place. Who, or what, was the restless, questing creature that had made those strange tracks to and from the old coat? Was it some half-witted vagrant, a woman possibly, whose trailing draperies had obliterated her own footprints? I had a closer look at the old garment. It was a military greatcoat of ancient pattern, with 1 or 2 tarnished silver buttons still attached to it, and had evidently seen much service. Turning it round on its peg, gingerly, with a finger and thumb, I discovered that just below the left shoulder there was a round hole as big as a penny, surrounded by an area of scorched and stained cloth, as though a heavy pistol had been fired into it at point-blank range. If a pistol bullet had indeed made that hole, then obviously the old coat at one period of its existence had clothed a dead man. A sudden repugnance for the thing overcame me, and with a slight shudder I let go of it. It may have been fancy or not, but all at once it seemed to me that there was more than an odour of mould and rotting cloth emanating from the thing, that there was a taint of putrefying flesh and bone. A taint of animal corruption, faint but unmistakable. I could sniff it in the air, and with it, something less definable but no less real. A sort of sixth sense feeling that the whole atmosphere of the place was slowly becoming charged with evil emanations from a black and shameful past. With an effort I pulled myself together. After all, what was there to be scared about? I had no need to fear human marauders, for in my hip pocket I carried a small but serviceable automatic. And as for ghosts, well, if such existed, they didn't usually walk in the daytime. The place certainly felt creepy, and I shouldn't have cared to spend the night there. But it would be ridiculous to allow mere idle fancies to drive me out again into that beastly rain before I'd made myself that badly needed hot drink and mended my bicycle. I therefore opened the door nearest to me and entered a smallish room that apparently had once been used as a study. The fireplace was on the side opposite to the door, and the wide ancient grate was still choked with the ashes of the last log consumed there. I picked up the poker, a cumbersome old thing with a knob as big as an orange, raked out the ashes, and laid my sticks in approved Boy Scout fashion. But the wood was damp, and after I'd used up half my matches, refused to do more than smoulder, whilst a backdraft from the chimney filled the room with smoke. In desperation, I went down on my hands and knees and tried to rouse the embers into flame by blowing on them. And in the middle of this irksome operation, I was startled by the sound of movement in the hall. A single, soft flop, as though someone had flung down a garment. I was on my feet in a flash, listening with every nerve taut. No further sound came, and, automatic in hand, I tiptoed to the door. There was nothing in the hall, nothing to be heard at all, save the steady swish of the rain outside. But from a spot on the floor directly below the old coat, the dust was rising in a little eddying cloud, as though it had just been disturbed. Pah! A rat, I told myself, and went back to my task. More vigorous blowing on the embers, more raking and poking, more striking of matches. And in the midst of it, again came that curious noise. Not very loud, but plain and unmistakable. Once more I went into the hall, and once more, except for another little cloud of dust rising from precisely the same spot as before, there was nothing to be seen. But that sixth sense warning of imminent danger was becoming more insistent. I had the feeling now that I was no longer alone in the old empty hall. That some unclean, invisible presence was lurking there, tainting the very air with its foulness. It's no use, I said to myself. I may be a nervous fool, but I can't stand any more of this. I'll collect my traps and clear out while the going's good. With this, I went back into the room, and keeping a nervous eye cocked on the door, began with rather panicky haste to repack my haversack. And just as I was in the act of tightening the last strap, there came from the hall a low, evil chuckle, followed by the sound of stealthy movement. I whipped out my weapon and stood where I was in the middle of the floor, facing the door, with my blood turning to ice. Through the chink between the door hinges, I saw a shadow pass. Then the door creaked a little, slowly began to open, and round it there came the coat. It stood there upright in the doorway, as God is above me, swaying a little as though uncertain of its balance. Collar and shoulders extended as though by an invisible wearer. It was the old musty coat I had seen hanging in the hall. For a space that seemed an eternity, I stood like a man of stone, facing the thing as it seemed to pause on the threshold. A dreadful sort of hypnotism held me rooted to the spot on which I stood, a hypnotism that completely paralysed my body and caused the pistol to slip from my nerveless fingers and yet left my brain clear. Mingled with my frozen terror was a feeling of deadly nausea. I knew that I was in the presence of ultimate evil, that the very aura of the hell-engendered thing reared there in the doorway was contamination, that its actual touch would mean not only the instant destruction of my body, but the everlasting damnation of my soul. And now it was coming into the room, with an indescribable bobbing sort of motion, the empty sleeves jerking grotesquely at its sides, the skirts flopping and trailing in the dust. It was slowly coming towards me, and step by step, with my bulging eyes riveted in awful fascination on the thing, I was recoiling before it. With the rigid, unconscious movement of an automaton, I drew back until I was brought up with my back pressed into the fireplace and could retreat no further. And still, with deadly malevolent purpose, the thing crept towards me. The empty sleeves were rising and shakily reaching out towards my throat. In another moment they would touch me, and then I knew, with the most dreadful certainty, that my reason would snap. A coherent thought somehow came into my burning brain, something that I had read or heard of long ago, the power of the holy sign against the forces of evil. With a last desperate effort of will, I stretched out a palsied finger and made the sign of the cross, and in that instant my other hand, scrabbling frenziedly at the wall behind me, came into contact with something cold and hard and round. It was the knob of the old heavy poker. The touch of the cold iron seemed to give me instant repossession of my faculties. With lightning swiftness I swung up the heavy poker and struck with all my force at the nightmare horror before me. And lo, on the instant the thing collapsed and became an old coat, nothing more, lying there in a heap at my feet. Yet, on my oath, as I cleared the hellish thing in a flying leap and fled from the room, I saw it, out of the tail of my eye, gathering itself together and making shape, as if it were to scramble after me. Once outside that accursed house, I ran as never man ran before, and I remember nothing more until I found myself half fainting before the door of a little inn. "Bring wine, in the name of God!" I cried, staggering inside. Wine was brought, and a little wondering group stood around me while I drank. I tried to explain to them in my bad French. They continued to regard me with puzzled looks. At length, a look of understanding came into the landlord's face. "Mon Dieu," he gasped. "Is it possible that Monsieur has been in that place? Quick, Juliette, Monsieur needs another bottle of wine." Later, I got something of the story from the landlord, though he was by no means eager to tell it. The deserted house had once been occupied by a retired officer of the First Napoleon's army. Judging from the landlord's story, he must have been one of the worst men that God ever allowed to walk the earth. "Most certainly, monsieur, he was a bad man, that one," concluded my host. "He killed his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay his hands on, even, it is said, his own daughters. In the end, one of them shot him in the back. The old chateau has an evil name. If you offered £1,000,000, you would not get one of our country folks to go near the place." As I said at the beginning, I know that the other fellows in the office are inclined, as it is, to regard me as being a bit queer, so I haven't told any of them this story. Nevertheless, it's perfectly true. My brand new bicycle and touring traps are probably still lying where I left them in the hall of that devil-ridden chateau. And anybody behind to collect them may keep them. The Mouse House, an original short story by Miss Worm. The story I shall tell you today is a personal one, for it involves a tale about my own home. As you may know, I live in England, down in a sleepy corner of Sussex, in a half-forgotten village. You'll forgive me, I trust, if I don't mention it by name. There are, after all, some rather odd people about. Not that I'm looking at anyone in particular. My home, Corkscrew Cottage, is some 2 miles distant from the village. Not far, you might think, in these modern times. But we do not embrace the modern here. Not in this part of the world. We still have a taste for things that more sophisticated people have long since abandoned. The name Corkscrew is recent, just a few hundred years, but the cottage is much older. It was certainly here when the first Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, and there is mention of a dwelling on this spot in the Domesday Book of 1085, which, even by Sussex standards, is rather a while. Long enough, at any rate, to have witnessed plenty of strange events. Back in the 19th century, an elderly lady known as Aunt Edith lived here. It was said that her betrothed perished on the battlefield of Waterloo, and her father had fought for the wrong side in America during that unfortunate spat over the price of tea. I shall leave it to your good judgment as to which side was the wrong side. With the coming of the railway, Aunt Edith found herself subjected to visits from a varied assortment of relatives, and one frost-bound snowy winter, her nephew Peter brought along a friend, and it is here that my tale really begins. The midwinter weather had grown unexpectedly fierce, as it often does in these parts, with the snow descending on the heath with such rapidity that it felt like a magician's trick, as if we had been convinced to look away whilst some sleight of hand magicked the country white. The track to the village had already disappeared beneath a thick wintry mantle, and it was therefore decided that Aunt Edith's guests should spend the night. Ah, the plot, as well as the snow, has thickened. Corkscrew Cottage is blessed with many rooms, and as you might imagine from its name, it has somewhat of a higgledy-piggledy layout. There are many twists and turns amongst its tiny passageways, with walls that were once on the outside, now on the inside, and what used to be the back door, now in the middle of the parlour. One particularly interesting room is found at the end of the cottage, just far enough away from the main part of the house to feel disconnected. This room is called the Mouse House. Now, the Mouse House is not, as you may have been supposing, overrun with vermin. Aunt Edith would never have allowed such a state of affairs. But it is so called because of its decoration. The oak beams have been carved with many mice over the centuries, and each new guardian of the cottage has added a mouse or two of their own. The telling of the tale informs us that Peter's friend, Richard, I believe his name was singularly unmoved by the bucolic charm of Corkscrew Cottage, and less than complimentary about Sussex in general. It is said, if you can imagine such a thing, that he preferred the so-called attractions of London. Of course, that may just be dramatic licence. Richard's complaints were long and dull. The Sussex snow was too cold, the Sussex wind too biting, and Sussex animals, too riddled with fleas. In fact, he saw fit to declare himself a hater of all things small and furry. One can only imagine the impression this left on his hostess, for Aunt Edith, being a sensible woman, put more stock in the company of animals than she did people. Her favourite faithful companion was a magnificent black cat who had wandered in from the road one cold night some 10 years or so before. She named him, with that delicious sense of humour that old ladies often possess, Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General. The time came to retire for the night, and Richard took up his candle, making his reluctant way through the darkened hallway to his room. The feeble light fluttered in the draught, and its dancing beams seemed to make the mice move. Ugh! Our cosmopolitan city dweller shuddered and undressed hurriedly. He hoped that there were plenty of traps to kill the little beasts. Next morning at breakfast, Aunt Edith remarked upon his pale countenance. "Alas, I did not sleep well," he finally admitted, and he grimaced as he plucked a singular cat hair from his trousers. "I was plagued by monstrous dreams, the result, no doubt, of too much cheese before bed." "What did you dream of?" asked Peter, but the more he pressed his friend, the less he said. "Suffice it to say," replied Richard, "I feel like I have been running to and fro all night." "I expect it was the sound of the wind in the attic," suggested Aunt Edith, though the night had been as still as a contented cat. "Or perhaps the snow falling from the thatch disturbed you." Yes, of course." But he remained troubled throughout the day, and kept a close eye on the weather, keen as he was to return to the city. Alas for Richard, the elements conspired against him, with snowflakes the size of an old cartwheel penny that covered everything in a silent velvet blanket. That evening they gathered around the fire, and the talk turned, as it often does at Corkscrew Cottage, to the netherworld, to witches and their familiars, and to those things half seen from the corner of your eye. "Surely we are too enlightened in these modern times to believe such things," scoffed Peter, and he looked to his friend to lend support. But Richard stayed unnaturally quiet. Despite Richard's obvious tiredness, he seemed in no hurry for his bed. But eventually he departed, and Aunt Edith and her nephew watched the light from his candle gradually dim as he made his way to the mouse house. No sooner had he gone than Matthew Hopkins returned to the room and leapt onto Peter's lap. "Have you noticed," asked the elderly lady, "that Matthew does not like our guest? He is usually such a friendly cat. Perhaps he can sense that Richard does not like animals, cats in particular. I have even seen him shooting them from his dining-room window." "Peter, how can you be friends with such a person?" Peter sighed and stroked the Witchfinder General's head. "I'm beginning to wonder that myself, Auntie, and I'm sure I saw him aim a kick at poor Kitty here." And such a statement, I'm sure you'll agree, sets Richard ripe for a glorious comeuppance. It was 3 o'clock when Aunt Edith was awoken by a terrible scream. With shaking fingers she lit her night candle and hastened into the passageway. There she met her nephew. "Oh, Peter," she cried, "it came from the mouse house. Do you suppose your friend has suffered some sort of night terror?" They stood for a moment and listened, unwilling to search for the source of that ghastly cry. But Corkscrew Cottage was silent, save for the tick of the long case clock in the hall. The floorboards creaked beneath their hesitant feet, and each door shrieked its unwillingness to open. So it was with some reluctance that they edged their way through the darkness, with nothing but their shadows for company. "Richard, are you ill?" The door to the mouse house refused to budge as Peter rattled the handle. It took all his strength to break open the door, for it had been locked securely from the inside. The bed was in frenzied disarray. The white snow-like sheets were scrunched into a chaotic muddle, and they hung like icicles from the empty bed. The blankets had been kicked away, and Richard's clothes lay in shredded tatters on the floor. But of Richard himself there was no sign. "Where can he be?" Peter ran to the window and flung open the curtains. The snow, almost as high as the sill, was crisp and untouched. Aunt Edith had nailed the window shut against the draughts. There was a sudden movement in the corner, and Peter grabbed the fireside poker, ready to strike whatever was lurking there. But it was only Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General. He was watching something closely. His amber eyes glinted in the candlelight, and his great black paw patted at the skirting board. It was just a carved mouse, but it was a mouse that Aunt Edith couldn't remember seeing before. The Work of Evil by William Croft Dickinson. Ever since his return to duty from his long illness, Maitland Allen, our keeper of printed books, had been singularly reluctant to grant any access to the special collections which were in his charge, so much so that the rare bookroom in the library had become well nigh as sacred and as difficult to enter as the secret courts of an Eastern harem. Thus, when he suddenly said to me, "Come, and I'll show you the whole collection," I was taken completely by surprise. I had asked for an early Italian work by Aeneas Sylvius. The assistant at the library counter had disappeared with my form, and Alan had come back with him. And now, strangely, I was to be shown the whole collection. Was this simply a piece of unexpected good fortune, or had the old man some ulterior purpose? I had noticed during the last 2 or 3 weeks that he had made a point of stopping to talk to me whenever we met in a room or corridor. Had he singled me out in some way from the rest of my colleagues? And if so, why? Everyone knew that his recent illness had made him a little queer. Opening a door marked "Staff Only," Alan led the way through a maze of book-lined passages until at last, passing a heavy steel door, we stopped before an inner iron grille. This he unlocked, and stepping aside, he ushered me into the room. I glanced around with curiosity, but he gave me no time for more than a quick glance. "There they are," he said, pointing to one of the stacks. "An extraordinary collection. A frightening collection. The Lucretia and Euryalus which you want happens to be in it, but it's very much a stranger there. For the rest, I hate them," and his voice rose nervously as if in emphasis. I walked over to the stack, but I noticed he did not accompany me. There, as I saw 2 long rows of beautiful bindings, I murmured something of my appreciation and delight. Reverently taking down one volume after another, I examined the bindings more closely. All were of a rich leather, elaborately tooled in a variety of intricate patterns, in which whorls and strange cabalistic signs predominated. I also turned to the title pages. Every work was either an incunabulum or of a date early in the 16th century, but every work was on the same theme. I ran my eye along the shelves, picking out the volumes which bore titles on their spines. Still the same theme. "Why," I exclaimed, turning towards him, "they're all on black magic and necromancy. What you might call a collection of evil, or at any rate a collection of evil intent, Who on earth gathered together all this devilry? It looks as though someone was striving hard to find something which at last would work. An unfortunate young man, whose history you know as well as I do, answered Alan slowly. John, 3rd Earl of Gowrie. You may remember that after studying here he became a law student at Padua, and was there said to have dabbled in magic and witchcraft. Well, here's his library, or part of it, and I wish it had never survived. Again I noticed the nervous pitch in his voice. Well, I replied lightly, if he did dabble in the forbidden art, he must have found it pretty ineffective. The very number of his books shows that. One would have thought that constant experiment followed by constant failure and disappointment would have been bound to bring disillusion. For a full minute, Alan made no reply. Instead, he gazed at me with an odd look in his eyes. Ineffective, he said at last. I wish to God you were right. Do you see that safe over there? It contains one further book belonging to Gowrie's collection. No one knows it is there but myself, and now you. That book is the one book which, at last, Gowrie found would work. Listen to me. You must listen to me. And I'll tell you a tale of devilry that has tormented me ever since this collection came in. Then you'll believe in effectiveness. He had pointed to a small safe in the corner of the room. I made a step towards it, but he seized me by the arm. Often I feel I must take the book in that safe and throw it into the middle of the sea, he continued, but I can't do it. I'm too afraid. Only one small book, yet it is evil itself. That one book seizes a man by the throat and strangles him to death. I looked at him in astonishment. Could it be Alan who was saying all this, and who was holding my arm so tightly that his fingers were biting into my flesh? Whatever do you mean? I asked, partly disturbed and partly angry at being held as though I were a child, faced with something which might be dangerous. I wish I knew, he replied slowly and in a quieter tone. All I can tell you is that within the last 18 months, 2 men have been strangled to death after looking into that book. That's all. I was dumbstruck, and not without reason. We stood there, tense and silent, like 2 conspirators surprised by something they couldn't name, and fearful of what it might mean. The collection came to us towards the end of the war, said Alan, breaking the silence at last. It came from the local antiquarian society, and it came in the wooden boxes in which it had been stored when Gowrie House was pulled down in 1805, and in which it had remained untouched until we opened those boxes in this very room, nearly 150 years later. It is said that the books were discovered in a wall closet, which had been panelled in and so lost to sight. It may well be so. Perhaps Gowrie himself entombed them that way. Perhaps he, too, tried to rid himself of an evil incubus. Perhaps Gowrie put one particular book, with all its fellows, into a hidden closet, as I have put that one particular book into a safe. Perhaps he, too, was afraid to do the one thing he ought to have done. Or perhaps he did something else. Perhaps he put his own curse upon the book, that no one should again open its pages and live. That, at any rate, has been its history here. First it was Fraser, who, you will remember, was our professor of chemistry before you came. As soon as the collection arrived, he was all agog to see it. Day after day he was here with his notebook, working out their formulae, he would say to me. Damned interesting, some of them. But one day he read too much. I had been in the read room that afternoon, and I didn't come here until nearly closing time. Fraser, as usual, was in his seat by the window there, but that afternoon he didn't look up with his cheery usual nod. Instead, as he looked up at my entrance, I saw that his face was drawn and white. "My God, Alan," he said in a strained voice. "This book is the devil himself. It should be burned to ashes." He pushed his chair back and seemed to recover himself. "Look," he continued, glaring at me with fierce earnestness. "I'm putting it here, in this empty case. Lock it in and let no one ever read it again." He strode to that wire-fronted case over there. It was empty then. Thrust in the book and waited for me to lock the door with my master key. Then he pushed past me and went out. It was the last I saw of him. That same night, he was found dead in his own room in the lab, strangled, and no one could explain how or why. He had a queer kind of lab coat, of which he was very proud. It was like an old-fashioned smock, which was tied by a fancy cord running through the neck. And when he was found, his hands were gripping that cord. It had been drawn so tight that it had throttled him. The students working in the lab had seen no one go into his room or come out of it. I know now that they wouldn't see anyone. I know, too, that Fraser's hands were at that cord in a vain struggle to loosen it and live. No one thought of connecting Fraser's death with the book he'd been reading. At first, I hardly associated the two events myself, yet it was not long before I found I was growing frightened of that book, lying by itself in its locked case. I tried to avoid looking at it, but it seemed to force its presence upon me. Perhaps a fortnight passed before I realised the truth. Then, suddenly, I knew. I knew that Fraser's death had been caused by it. Frightened as I was, I still had courage enough to do one thing. Unknown to the rest of the staff, I removed from the library catalogue all the entries relating to it. Fraser's death should not go unheeded. No one should read that book again. No one should even know of its existence. Had I dared, I would have burnt it, as Fraser had said it should be burned. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Already it had me in its power. I was afraid of it. And so, young Inglis had to die, a second victim. He had come to us as a part-time student assistant, and had quickly proved his worth. So much so that special tasks were soon assigned to him automatically, and, at a time when I was unluckily absent for a few days with influenza, he was given the task of checking the shelf catalogue of the special collections. You can imagine my horror when on the day of my return to duty I found him here, holding the book in his hands, open, and reading it. As soon as he saw me, he called out, "I found an incunabulum, which is not in the catalogue. It's filthy with dust." But I rushed up and seized the thing from him. I shoved it back into the case and relocked the door, while he looked at me open-mouthed. But what could I say? I simply dare not tell him the truth. As I saw it, to tell him the truth would be to tell him his own sentence of death. I made some feeble excuse, which I know he didn't believe, and sent him off. And when I sat down, sick and faint, what could I do to save him? Nothing. He was doomed. The evil thing was upon him, and he could never escape. I cursed myself for my own cowardice. Why, at least, had I not warned him? Had the book so laid its spell upon me that I even feared the ridicule which might follow a warning? Poor beggar, he didn't escape. When the library was closing that night, one of the staff found that the automatic lift wouldn't work. Naturally, he assumed that someone on one of the floors had failed to shut the door properly, and he went to look. He found the door which wasn't shut. He also found Inglis. He was trapped by the outer door, and strangely he was trapped by the neck, almost as though he had entered the lift, and then, as the door was sliding to, had put out his head to look at something. Stranger still, but only to those who didn't know what I knew. The poor fellow was dead. I tell you, the pressure of the outer doors on that lift is so light that you can hold them back easily with one hand. Yet Inglis was dead. He'd been throttled by the light pressure of a lift door. Fraser had been strangled on the day he'd opened the book, and so had Inglis. Can you wonder that the same night I had what was called a nervous breakdown? I was away for over a year, and as you probably know, I've only been back for some 6 weeks or so. Surprisingly, I have kept my reason, though sometimes I'm not sure. Perhaps I am mad, or perhaps I am suffering from some delusion. Yet I was the only person who knew that Inglis had opened the book. I was the only person who knew that Inglis was doomed to die. And he did die, as Fraser had died. God forgive me, I should destroy the thing, but I daren't. I'm too afraid of it. Yet about a fortnight ago, the day I spoke to you in the upper hall, I was brave enough to move it out of the bookcase and to lock it away in that safe. You gave me the courage to do that, even though you didn't know you'd done so. Now I'm afraid again. I feel it is laughing at me behind that steel door and biding its time. You must forgive me, but I had to tell you this. One day I too may be found strangled, and you, at least, will know the reason why. As you may imagine, I was not particularly pleased at having this extraordinary burden of knowledge so suddenly thrust upon me. Yet as I crossed the quad back to my own room, my thoughts ran in a different vein. Poor old Alan, I thought. No wonder he had a breakdown. No wonder he's queer. Fancy living with that on your mind all the time. Poor wretch, a victim to his own imagination, with a harmless book locked up in his safe, and fearing it as though it possessed all the malignant power of some genie in the Arabian Nights, and mortally afraid to do the one thing which would bring relief. But I did Alan an injustice. I had given my lecture next morning, and was talking to a student in my retiring room when Wallace, one of the lecturers in the Modern Languages department, and Alan's next-door neighbour, opened the door and beckoned me outside. "Did you know Maitland Allen was dead?" he asked. "Dead?" I repeated. "Yes. Apparently, last night he was all worked up about something. Kept walking up and down his study, saying in a loud voice, 'I will do it, I will do it,' and generally worrying his housekeeper out of her wits. Then suddenly at about 9 o'clock, she heard him go into the hall. Peeping round her door, she saw him put on a cap, his scarf and his overcoat, and literally rush out of the house. By this time, thoroughly alarmed, she came to us. I did my best to calm her down, but she was so upset that in the end I offered to go back with her and to wait up for his return. He didn't come in until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. We heard him open the front door, and then, just when he'd shut it again, we heard him give a queer kind of strangled, choking cry. We rushed into the hall and saw him half hanging from the door and half sprawled on the rug in the hall. One end of his scarf had caught in the door as he'd shut it, and when he turned away it had pulled tight around his neck and had trapped him. We opened the door at once and released him, but when we tried to help him to his feet again, we discovered to our horror that he was dead. I came over to tell you, for I believe he had taken quite a liking to you. But I was no longer listening. My thoughts were rushing madly towards one word which seemed to loom larger and larger, and the one word was strangled. Fraser, Inglis, Allen. Could it all be coincidence? Or could such things indeed be true? Naturally, the Procurator Fiscal conducted an inquiry into Allen's death. A boatman stated that Allen, whom he identified, had knocked him up about midnight and asked to be rowed a full mile out to sea. At first he had demurred, because Allen had seemed very demented. but an offer of £5 had seemingly settled the matter. He had rowed Alan out to sea, and when he had told him that they were well beyond the full mile for which he had asked, Alan, to his utter surprise, had suddenly plucked a small book from his coat pocket, had raised it with both hands above his head, and had hurled it down into the water with all his force. Then, said the boatman, he crouched himself down in the boat as though he were afraid someone was going to hit him, and he stayed like that till I tied up again, when he jumped out of the boat and fair ran along the quay as if the devil himself were chasing him. The doctors were puzzled but unanimous. Despite the softness and natural elasticity of the scarf, they had been surprised to find a sharp mark around Alan's neck, but they were convinced he had died of shock. His heart, they said, was in poor condition. Any shock would probably be too much for it. And I alone knew what that shock would be. I alone knew what would flash through the poor wretch's mind when he felt that sudden, unexpected tightening of his scarf around his neck. So much I had written yesterday when my mind was free, but how different is today. Today all Alan's fear and dread are now my own. Today, at the close of the library committee, our librarian spoke casually, as of a matter of little importance. He had looked over the rare bookroom, he said, after Alan's death, and there he found, inside the safe, a book which belonged to the Gowrie collection, but which, to his surprise, had no entry in the catalogue. Dazed and bewildered, I have found my way back to my room, and as I write this down, I am prey to every wild imagining. Can it be that Alan, deranged and overwrought on that last fearful night, cast the wrong book away? How could he? It was the only book within the safe. Yet reason recoils from that other thought, that a book can return from the depths of the sea. Reason? How long can reason prevail against this fearful question that is now pulsing through my mind? Already our librarian has handled the book and opened it. The Cupboard in the Corner, an original story, written and read by Miss Worm. Last winter had proved uncommonly dismal, with weeks of endless damp, and I had run out of all those little jobs that we save up for when we are confined to barracks. My writing was suffering from the lack of stimulation, and I was half convinced that I'd never write again. My imagination, untethered from its usual mooring, bumped against the smallest of things and blamed them for my lack of creativity. My chair was too lumpy, my pen too scratchy, and the light was too light. Having drifted aimlessly for 3 self-absorbed days, I developed a fancy for turning the box room at the back of the cottage into a writing room. Nothing elaborate, just a desk and a comfortable chair and a delicious bucketful of books. It's not a big room. It would be optimistic to say it's any more than 8 feet square, but it's blessed with good light and a pleasing view across 4 Maidens Meadow to the sea. I set about the transformation with gusto, and by lunchtime the room was cleared of all the flotsam that invariably takes up residence in underused and unloved spaces. A large rug covered the floor, an ancient monstrosity full of moth that must have lain untouched since Noah was a lad, and I rolled it up and began sweeping the floorboards. They were painted cream, and I traced the shadowed footprints of the furniture which had once stood there. A bookcase beneath the window, a chair beside it, and a child's bed against the wall. The room was so small that it would be impossible to arrange the furniture in any other way. The floor paint had been spoilt by a dark, crescent-shaped scuff in the corner. Created by an ill-fitting door, it had scraped the paint back to the boards. It caught my attention because there was no door, and nothing to suggest there ever had been. I wondered at first whether the entrance from the landing had been moved, but the shape of the room wouldn't allow for it, and as we were at the end of the house, there was no possibility, sadly, of a secret room. There was space, however, for a large cupboard beneath the eaves. I ran my hands across the wallpaper and found a thin vertical groove that ran upwards from the scuff. The aged wall covering split as soon as I pushed my fingernail down it. Well, who am I to argue with that sort of encouragement? And within 5 minutes, piles of ripped wallpaper lay at my feet, along with some prized-off skirting board, and I found myself staring at a wooden door no more than 4 feet high. A jagged hole showed where the latch had been removed, and I hooked my finger in and was about to pull it open when I paused. Why would anyone seal up a door? My imagination instantly led me down various paths, as I'm sure yours is now, most of which involved mummified bodies or walled-up nuns. But curiosity got the better of me, and with a deep breath, I yanked the door open. You can imagine my reaction when I realised the cupboard was completely empty. There was no desiccated priest scratching away a final prayer, and no wife entombed by a murderous husband. There was not even a pile of papers that might be hiding a contested will. The cupboard in the corner contained not so much as a cobweb. Or so I thought. For the rest of the day, I trudged up and down stairs with furniture, and prowled around the cottage, snaffling up ornaments and knickknacks for my new-found kingdom. My books were arranged to please both the eye and the scholar, and my chair was plump enough for even the most delicate of bottoms. I settled back in my seat and was admiring my handiwork when my eye was drawn back to the cupboard. The door had swung open, and a disagreeable draught scuttled across the floor to nip at my ankles. Perhaps that was why it was blocked up, some untraceable breach in the outside wall that funneled in the east wind. I got up to close the door and found, to my surprise, that the cupboard wasn't empty after all. Tucked into the far corner was a doll. I don't know how I could have missed it, though I suppose the light from a different angle. I picked it up with reluctance, for I have never been fond of dolls, and I took it closer to the window so I might examine my find. It had some age to it, Edwardian, I guessed, for her head and hands were made of delicate painted china, and she was dressed for a day at the beach, with modest blue bathing dress and matching hat. She had a pretty little face, and would surely have been a favourite for the little girl that owned her. But sweet as she was, I was keen to put her down, for she had been painted with a glint in her eye I found unsettling. And with a shiver I popped her on the mantelpiece so she might have a view of the sea, and went downstairs for tea. The change of scenery refreshed my writing just as I'd hoped, and 2 days later I was writing a short story called Wasps when I was distracted by the distant sound of a child crying. I put up with it for a few minutes, and then, having flung my pen aside in an appropriately artistic manner, I crossed to the window to locate the source of the wailing. There are few travellers, intentional or otherwise, on the lane past my house, but there is the occasional lost soul seeking a shortcut to the sea, and I expected to see a yowling child being dragged seaward by an irritated parent. There was no one in sight, and I resumed my seat after a quick detour via the biscuit barrel. No sooner had I brushed the crumbs from my desk than the crying resumed. It was a frightened sort of mewling, and I heard, quite distinctly, "Where are you, Mummy?" I ignored it as best I could, but the day was drawing to a close and growing chill, and I had a vague idea that cold, wet children tend to die at the drop of a hat, however inconvenient it might be, so I decided I'd better look for the thing before it perished on my doorstep. I spent the next 2 hours rummaging through every hedge and thicket between here and the sea, but found neither hide nor hair of a misplaced child. A dense fog rolled in from the coast, and by the time I returned to the cottage I could barely see a yard ahead of me, and I returned just in time, for the moment I opened the gate, my torch died. The fire in the range was still alight as I shrugged off my wet coat, and I spent a pleasant 10 minutes toasting my toes in the quiet darkness of the kitchen. My trek through the surrounding fields had made me surprisingly tired. I was hardly able to stay awake, and in my tiredness I had not yet closed the curtains against the night. My eye was constantly drawn to the window, though I could see nothing through the glass. It was as though the outside world had been stolen away and replaced with nothing, not even empty space. I suppressed a shudder and poured myself a glass of wine. Perhaps I'd fallen asleep, for I was suddenly aware that the coals in the range had dimmed and the air grown bitter. A sharp, pricking coldness from the stone floor crept over my feet and twined itself around my legs. A dreadful sensation of smothering overtook me, catching at my breath, as if the fog had found its way indoors and was stealing the air away. I leapt up and blundered into the edge of the table as I scrabbled for the light switch, my heart racing. Wait! There was a footstep on the stair. I stood in the dark and listened. The only sound was my heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. There! Another! Someone was coming down the stairs. Like a fool, I'd left the door unlocked. I backed up against the table and felt behind me for a weapon, but my hand found nothing. The footsteps paused outside the door, and I held my breath as the latch slowly lifted. The door creaked open, and a dark figure stood there. I squinted into the pitch-black hallway, desperately trying to make out the size of my opponent. The person paused, and I realised that the light from the range, feeble though it was, had given away my presence. "Oh!" It was a woman's voice, thank goodness, and my shoulders sagged with relief. I could see little of her, other than she was slight and slim, and she wore a loose coat over what appeared to be a long nightgown. "Oh!" she repeated, as if surprised to find me there. "I didn't know anyone had returned." Then, with a sudden rush of excitement, she asked, "Is there news? Have they found her?" "News? No, Oh, the child." So there was a missing child, and this woman must have come in to ask for help, or seek temporary shelter from the fog. "Yes, my child. My Jenny." She came into the kitchen, and I pulled out a chair for her. "The men from the village are searching for her." "Let me put the light on," I said, and I went to move past her. "No, please." She grabbed my arm, and the coldness of her touch seeped through my sleeve. She must have spent hours on the heath to be so cold. "I'd prefer the dark. I've grown accustomed to it." "Yes, of course. Well, let me fetch you a drink. You're chilled to the bone." I patted around the table for the bottle. Why could I find nothing tonight? No, please, don't trouble yourself. Oh, my poor little Jenny ran out in this weather." What happened to her? I asked. Did she run off down the lane? No, I don't understand it. One moment she was in her room, and the next she was gone. I'd swear she hadn't left the house. She spoke calmly, in a cultured, old-fashioned way, though her voice was clipped with tension. I wouldn't worry too much, I said, with an attempt at hearty reassurance. There aren't any marshes or cliffs where she might come to harm. She's probably taken shelter under a hedge. She'll come out when she hears the searchers calling. The silence pressed in on us, and the falseness of my words hit me. No sound came from outside. There were no shouts, no whistles, no cries. I stared again at the window, and tried in vain to see the beam of a rescuer's torch. Nothing. Nothing but endless fog and darkness. The old house creaked as it settled for the night, like a groan of pain, and I pictured the fog squeezing the walls and crushing the building to matchsticks as it settled its weight on the roof. I shivered, suddenly claustrophobic, and I suppressed the urge to jump up and switch on all the lights. Beside me, her breath quickened and she fidgeted in her chair, plucking at something in her hands. It was the doll from the cupboard. I suppose she must have picked it up from the mantelpiece when she was searching the house for her daughter, the sort of absent-minded thing a distracted mother might do. I must search for her. She stood up suddenly, and the scrape of the chair jarred the silent kitchen. It's better if you stay here, I said. If Jenny sees the house, she'll come in. No, I must. Look, I'll go. I scrambled for my boots. I've had longer to warm up. She grabbed me again. No, I can't stay here alone. I should go mad. But you're right. One of us must stay. Please, let it be you. Desperation filled her voice, and I knew that if I left, she would only follow. All right, but let me put new batteries in the torch for you. She was gone before I could stand. Her nightdress swished in the darkness, and the front door bounced against the wall as she flung it open. I followed after her and peered out into the night. The woman had already vanished. I strained to hear her footsteps or the shouts of the searchers until I could stand the emptiness no more. The fog swirled around me, and as I turned away, I had the oddest sensation that somehow I was surrounded by something alive, or something that envied my being alive. I half believed that the fog made to follow me in, but hesitated on the threshold, and then slowly backed away. My hand shook as I closed the door tightly behind me, but I left it on the latch in case the woman returned. Then I ran straight upstairs to the box room. I stood at the window, cocooned in the darkness, but I saw and heard nothing of the rescue party. Not a single torch beam pierced the fog. Eventually, I sank exhausted into my chair, but sleep eluded me, uneasy knowing that the woman had been in my home. A salty dampness lingered, as if the fog had clung to her, was somehow part of her, and had stayed behind. My gaze came to rest on the mantelpiece, and I realised, with unwarranted relief, that she had taken the doll with her. It was late when I awoke, cramped and unrefreshed from my night in the chair. The sky was a bright winter's blue, and the air was filled with birdsong. The heath was empty of people, and there were no police beating through the bracken, a good sign that the emergency was over and the girl had been found. Even so, a strange sensation of disquiet accompanied me downstairs, an urgent, nameless worry that I'd forgotten something important. I entered the hallway and noticed that the front door was locked and bolted. I'd left it open for the child's mother. Had she returned? Or had someone else entered the house whilst I was asleep? And were they still here? I ran into the kitchen and stuttered to a halt. There was only one chair pulled out. Mine. The other chair was still in the corner, a pile of washing waiting on the seat. The wine bottle was close at hand, and on the table, right by me, was the torch. I could have grabbed either instantly when I was fumbling for a weapon. I picked up the torch, and it sparked into life. The batteries weren't dead after all. Doubt overtook me. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I fallen asleep in the chair and dreamt it? And then I realised what was nagging at me. I took the stairs 2 at a time and ran back to the box room. Kneeling by the bookcase, I pulled the books from their shelves until I found what I wanted. A slim volume called The Lost Souls of Sussex. Halfway through was the story of a missing girl, little Jenny Brown, who disappeared in 1912, 100 years before. She was never seen again, though the men of her village searched for days. I sat on the floor and read the account with a growing sense of unease. For Jenny Brown had lived with her mother in Corkscrew Cottage, and her bedroom was a small room at the back of the house. An odd scraping noise came from me, and my blood ran cold, though I knew what it was. The cupboard door had opened, catching on the floorboards where it always had done. The dank, briny scent of the sea filled the room. I didn't want to, but I had to look inside. There, tucked into the corner, was the doll, and I heard, from the back, "Mummy?"